What comes to your mind when you hear about Canada? I think that's the landscapes, wide forests, cold lakes, and quiet towns. But during World War II, Canada became something else. It became a factory of wings, a training ground for pilots, and a lifeline in the sky. Canadian aircraft didn't chase glory. They carried men, supplies, and hope across oceans and land. These aircraft formed the Allied backbone. And today, we are revealing every deadliest Canadian aircraft used in World War II for you. So let's dive into dark history. Avro Lancaster MKX. If I talk about weight in the air, then this one always comes on top. It was built in Malton, Ontario, by Victory Aircraft. The Canadian Lancaster MKX wasn't a side project. It was a full-scale war machine with 430 aircraft produced on Canadian soil. Instead of British engines, these bombers ran on Packard-built Merlin engines from the United States, and many later versions carried a different mid-upper turret layout than earlier RAF builds. Inside, life wasn't heroic. Crews existed in a cold, shaking metal tube, surrounded by fuel, bombs, and ammunition, night after night, knowing statistics weren't on their side. Canada's bomber force in Europe paid heavily for every successful run. Even when the war ended, these airframes didn't rest. Late-war Canadian MKXs were adapted into post-war maritime reconnaissance and search and rescue aircraft, proving how bomber bones kept working long after the bombing stopped. Handley Page, Halifax. Let me tell you honestly, this aircraft carried numbers most people never want to look at. Halifax squadrons formed the spine of No. 6, RCAF Group, under RAF Bomber Command. And that group's record tells the real story. 40,822 sorties flown, 814 aircraft lost, and about 5,700 airmen who never came back. That's what Allied backbone actually costs. The Halifax fought mainly at night, pushing through darkness to strike factories, rail lines, ports, and U-boat infrastructure, targets designed to bleed enemy logistics dry. As the war dragged on, later versions like the MK-07s arrived with more powerful Bristol Hercules engines and extra fuel capacity, built to fly farther and survive longer. It helped, but only so much. Come home more often still left a lot of empty bunks behind. De Havilland Mosquito. Well, this one never even pretended to be normal. People called it the wooden wonder, and, less kindly, the termite's dream, because so much of it was made from plywood and wood construction. And Canada didn't just fly it. Canada built it. 1,032 Mosquitoes rolled out of de Havilland's Toronto plant, forming a serious slice of overall production. Some of the Canadian fighter bomber versions, like the FB Mk-26, ran on Packard Merlin 2 and 25 engines, with around 300 built plus later conversions. A clear example still exists, a Canadian-built Mosquito Mk-XX bomber manufactured in 1944, taken on by the RCAF in June 1944. That same year, Canadian Mosquito squadrons went straight into the V-1 nightmare. 409 Squadron destroyed 10 flying bombs. 418 Squadron shot down 82. Fast work. Brutal skies. Hawker Hurricane. Imagine racing a war that's already started. That's what Canada did with the Hurricane. At Canadian Car and Foundry in Fort William, Ontario, production moved fast enough that the first Canadian-built Hurricane was completed in February 1940. Those airframes didn't stay home. They were shipped to Britain and flown in the Battle of Britain, thrown directly into one of the war's first survival tests. By the end, 1,451 Hurricanes had been built in Canada, but many sent overseas arrived as incomplete airframes, and a large number were delivered without engines, meaning ground crews still had to finish them before they could fight. The Hurricane's reputation wasn't glamorous later in the war, but that was the point. It was the fighter that kept getting used because the war needed numbers immediately, not perfection tomorrow. Bristol Bolingbroke. The Bolingbroke was Canada's license-built version of the Bristol Blenheim Mk4, produced by Fairchild Aircraft Limited in Canada, with 626 built between 1939 and 1943. Its work rarely made headlines. Maritime Patrol put it over cold water, scanning for threats that never announced themselves. Training duties filled the rest of its hours, shaping crews who would later move into aircraft with far worse survival math. That mix gave the Bolingbroke a strange place in the war. Part guardian, part classroom. It mattered in another way, too. Building it forced Canada to develop more serious manufacturing methods and a skilled aviation workforce, accelerating industrial growth that existed only because the war demanded it. Progress, powered by pressure, with a darker reason underneath. Consolidated Canso. You know that feeling when a job doesn't end? It just stretches until the horizon? That was the Canso's world. Endless ocean, bad weather, no front lines. Canada didn't build a few of these. It built a huge portion of them, around 620 Canadian-built Cansos Caesars Catalinas, rolling out of Boeing Canada and Canadian Vickers plants. The timeline alone shows how fast Canada moved. The first Boeing-built Canso flew in July 1941, while Canadian Vickers followed in December 1942. Some versions, like the Canso A, were amphibious, lifting from open water, while others were later rebuilt into freight carriers and search and rescue aircraft. Their real war lived in slow hours, anti-submarine patrols, convoy escort, emergency rescues. The danger wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. A crew could simply disappear, swallowed by weather and water, with no witness and no wreckage. Westland Lysander, let me paint this one for you. Because there were no sleek runways, not roaring formations. Now, finally, picture mud. Grass, broken fields. That's where the Lysander belonged. Built under license in Malton, Ontario, National Steel Car, Canada, produced 225 of them between 1938 and 1939. It was engineered for short takeoffs and landings, able to leap out of places that barely deserved to be called airstrips. That design made it perfect for the jobs nobody bragged about. By 1940, the Lysander was already sliding into the uncomfortable world of obsolete for frontline reconnaissance. But it didn't vanish. It was pushed sideways into the war. Training duties, target towing, gritty support work that kept the system running while others took the spotlight. The Lysander story isn't about glory. It's about an aircraft built for rough ground that spent the war doing rough, necessary work without applause. Nordøen Norseman. This one didn't start life dreaming of war. It could land on unimproved strips and harsh terrain, so when conflict came, it slipped easily into utility hauling, remote transport, and support flying. Over 900 Norsemen were built between 1936 and 1959, and many of them wore wartime markings for both the RCAF and the USAF. One quiet example carries weight. An RCAF Norseman built in 1943 served in Montreal at a wireless school, helping train the communication skills that fed the wider war machine. It didn't drop bombs. It moved people, equipment, and knowledge. Sometimes that's the darker kind of importance. The Norseman first flew on November 14, 1935, built for bush flying, places where runway meant whatever stretch of earth didn't kill you. That design turned out to be perfect for a world at war. North American Harvard. If aircraft could leave fingerprints on history, the Harvards, T6, would be everywhere. Canada didn't just use it, it mass-produced it. 350 Harvards were built in Canada by Nordoyne and Canadian Car and Foundry, making it the most produced Canadian-built aircraft of the war. And it shows. This machine trained huge waves of Commonwealth aircrew, forming the gateway between knowing how to fly and being sent into combat. Nordoyne alone built 2,857 Harvards from 1942, powered by R-1340 engines, locking Canada into the center of Allied training. Ingenium calls it one of the most successful trainers ever, and the darker reason is simple. It was unforgiving. It shaped pilots fast. It punished mistakes. That edge is exactly why it worked. Every smooth ace who later fought over Europe or the Atlantic passed through something like this cockpit first. Avro Anson. Here's where the war quietly taught people how to survive it. The Avro Anson became the backbone of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, with nearly 3,000 produced overall and more than 20,000 aircrew trained on the type. Canada didn't treat it as a copy-and-paste aircraft. Canadian service brought substantial redesigns, including North American engines and altered airframes and equipment. The scale was massive. 4,213 Ansons were operated in Canada, and 2,451 of them were built there. And when the Atlantic got dangerous, some didn't stay in classrooms. During the Battle of the St. Lawrence, training units were mobilized for real patrols, carrying bombs, turning instruction aircraft into frontline tools. The Anson lived between worlds, half school, half war, preparing crews while occasionally forcing them to face exactly what they were training for. Curtiss Kitty Hawk. Let's switch the mood for a second and picture this: cold wind, empty sky, and an aircraft that never pretended to be polite. For home defense alone, 134 Kitty Hawk variants were acquired, spread across Kitty Hawk ciphers, IA, the Threads and Ivory models. But its story didn't stay close to home. On September 25, 1942, high above Kiska in the Aleutian Islands, No. 111 Squadron's commanding officer, K.A. Boomer, shot down a Japanese roof float plane in a Kitty Hawk. An encounter so remote, it barely feels real. The Kitty Hawk entered RCAF service in late 1941, flown both overseas and at home, filling the gap between what Canada had and what Canada desperately needed. The Kitty Hawk P-40 wasn't elegant. It was blunt, and whether guarding Canadian airspace or clashing over distant islands, it served as one of Canada's hardest-nosed defenders. Douglas Digby, some aircraft arrive as answers. The Digby D-18 arrived as a necessity. In 1940, the RCAF acquired 20 Digby MCUF-1 aircraft and immediately handed them to No. 10 Squadron for anti-submarine patrols. By that point, the design was already outclassed, slower than new bombers, carrying a small bomb load with limited defensive armament. But the Atlantic didn't wait for better options. Crews flew Digbys, where endurance and luck mattered as much as engineering, pushing them across gray water in search of shapes that shouldn't be there. Under Eastern Air Command, Canadian Digbys carried out 11 recorded attacks on U-boats, part of a grinding, patient air war most people never picture. The Digby's reputation wasn't built on victories. It was built on showing up early, flying long, and holding a fragile line when Canada needed something immediately. Fleet Model 60 Fort. The Fleet Model 60 Fort was a two-seat intermediate trainer built by Fleet Aircraft of Canada in Fort Erie, Ontario, and it holds a rare title, the only aircraft actually designed and built in Canada during World War II. It first flew in 1940, entered service in 1941, and 101 were delivered to the RCAF. On paper, It was meant to bridge the gap between primary and advanced training. Reality had other plans. With priorities shifting and surplus advanced trainers arriving, the fort was redirected into wireless operator training, shaping the communication backbone of air operations. Its career was short, and that's the point. Before it could fully settle into frontline training, it was already repurposed. The fort quietly reflects how Canada's war machine kept reshaping itself. Urgency first, comfort never. Ferry battle imagine being built for a war that has already moved past you. By the time global fighting exploded, it was already obsolete, painfully vulnerable in real combat, and slow by the standards of a rapidly changing sky. Early in the war, many crews flew battles into actual operations and paid heavily for it, suffering serious losses due to its weak defenses and limited speed. That harsh lesson reshaped its future. Instead of frontline bombing, the battle was pushed into the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, serving in bombing schools and gunnery training. The aircraft became a living warning. The ferry battle. A British light bomber designed in 1936 reached Canada in large numbers, with the RCF operating around 739 of them. Its failures in combat helped drive Canada's determination to develop better aircraft and safer, stronger training systems. Progress born from experience that hurt. Lockheed Ventura. Let me take you away from airfields and into the weather. Heavy fog. Rolling black water. No landmarks. The RCAF used it for long-range patrol, anti-submarine operations, and bomber support missions across both the Atlantic and Pacific fronts. Compared to older patrol aircraft, the Ventura was fast, capable of carrying bombs and depth charges, and crucial in helping close the deadly mid-Atlantic gap where U-boats once hunted almost freely. But the numbers don't carry the fear. Crews flew endless hours over icy seas, often in pea-soup fog and violent storms, knowing a single engine failure meant the ocean would decide the rest. The Ventura was a convoy's lifeline, and a reminder that the air war didn't always explode. The Lockheed Ventura wasn't built in Canada, but it became deeply Canadian in service. Well, Canada's aircraft didn't chase fame. They carried the war on tired wings, across black oceans and burning skies. If these stories added some knowledge to your history, then hit like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support keeps these untold chapters flying. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.